Hello, welcome back to the book chat series. I'm Stephen Best, the director of Berkeley's Townsend Center for the Humanities. Today, we're pleased to welcome Asad Ahmed, a professor in the Department of Middle Eastern Languages and Cultures, to discuss his new book, Palimpsests of Themselves, Logic and Commentary in Post-Classical Muslim South Asia. Joining Asad to discuss the book is Peter Adamson, professor of philosophy at LMU in Munich. Peter, thanks for joining us from so many time zones away. We look forward to your conversation. To those listening, please join us the week after Thanksgiving on Wednesday, November 30th, for a conversation with Nicholas Matthew, a professor in the Department of Music. Professor Matthew will introduce us to his new book, The Haydn Economy: Music, Aesthetics, and Commerce in the Late 18th Century. His interlocutor will be Alyssa Tamarkin, professor in the Department of English. Nick and Alyssa's conversation will be our final book chat for the fall season. Now let's join Peter and Asad.
Okay, hi Asad, great to see you.
Good to see you.
So we're going to be talking about your amazing new book, and I thought we could sort of move through various themes that you explore in the book. And maybe we could start by just setting the scene a bit chronologically and geographically. I suppose that when people think about philosophy in the Islamic world, they're usually thinking about what happened in, say, the 9th to the 12th century CE. They're thinking about figures like Ibn Sina, often called Avicenna, or Al-Farabi, or Ibn Rushd out in Muslim Spain, often known as Averroes. But here first of all, we're a lot later in the texts that you're looking at in this book. And we're also in South Asia, as it even says in the title of the book. So could you sort of set the scene for us historically?
Sure, yeah. And thank you again, Peter, for agreeing to have this conversation. I'm delighted to be here. And thank you to the Humanities Center for organizing it. So the scene, I'll go very quickly to the beginning of things, and then I'll move very fast. A little bit slower. So, most of us know that there is a tradition of the appropriation and naturalization of the Greek philosophical tradition in Arabic and in Islamic civilization. And this process begins to take off at full speed after the Abbasid Revolution, which happens in 749, the Common Era. And there is, of course, the investment of important elements of society in this translation movement. So Aristotle and late antique authors and texts from other traditions enter the Arabic language. And in the case of philosophy and logic, these works are carried forward initially by translators who happen to be Christians who know Greek and Syriac and Arabic, but very quickly their students take on the mantle and continue the work forward. So as you mentioned, we have 9th century figures and 10th century figures such as Al-Kindi and Farabi, Al-Kindi on whom you have written definitive works. And then after that, we get one major figure is Avicenna, who becomes the point of departure for further dialectics in the tradition, in many ways replacing Aristotle as the point of reference. Avicenna, who dies in 1037, his work was a major synthesis and refutation and reorganization and remodeling and introducing new inquiries into the system that he had been reading, namely the Aristotelian tradition. So he makes contributions in fields of modal logic, in physics, for example, has a major new synthesis in his metaphysics, on which some colleagues that we're friends with have written. And then after Avicenna, there's a dialectic that breaks out on his own contributions, starting among other people with somebody like Fakhruddin Razi, again, on whom you have written. And he challenges many of the conclusions and positions taken up by Avicenna in a spirit of dialectic that was quite common. This is a figure who dies very early in the 13th century, Razi. And Razi's, dialectics, support, critique, contributions then set off the stage for further dialectics and arguments with the Avicennan tradition, which culminate through various important figures in textbooks of the 13th century. And I'm now going to shift squarely into logic by people like Katibi, for example, and Tusi and Khunaji and others. Those textbook traditions begin to produce commentaries, and this becomes a main point of philosophical inquiry and logical inquiry and legal theory inquiry and so on in the Islamic tradition. Very quickly moving forward now, from there we get these commentarial traditions that in a space of dialectic arrive in various courts. Two important figures on the scene are people like Taftazani, for example, who wrote a logic work. We're not yet in India, wait for it. So Taftazani and Jurjani, for example, and then after that, a lot of the tradition, quite a bit of the tradition is received into the city of Shiraz. And here we have basically in the 15th century onward, an important tradition of philosophical and logical output that takes place. Two important figures in Shiraz are Dawani, Jalaluddin Dawani, and the Dashtaki father and son Sadruddin and Ghayafuddin. And their heirs and their works are then absorbed into through migrations, partly forced by political changes, into North India. So these important texts of logic and philosophy then filter into North India, and one can easily track the genealogy of these scholars, the courts where they were patronized, and eventually the Indian logical tradition, mostly being written in Arabic, as an heir to the Shirazi tradition largely. But of course, there are other influences too, from Isfahan, for example, that were also absorbed into the Indian landscape. In South Asia, the mantle is picked up by an important family called the Farangi Mahalli family. This is a family of scholars whose progenitor is a person called Qutbuddin, and his son, most importantly, Nizamuddin, is the founder, let's say, of this method of training in South Asia called the Dars-e-Nizami, the Nizami training circuit and method. And he, along with his students, then established a robust system of training in the religious college, the madrasa, of logic and philosophy, mostly sustained by commentarial practices and commentarial traditions with a strong and dense network of scholars and texts that are interacting with each other. Starting in the early 17th century, the internal dialectics of this tradition in the 17th century that are engaged with Shiraz then end up and result in the production of new base texts. My book is about one of these base texts, the Sulam al-Ulum. And the tradition is mainly carried forward throughout India, but the main figures in this tradition are somehow linked with this family, with this Farangi Mahalli family. One of their offshoots is another family called the Khairabadi family, and of course their students and so on, who also carry forward this tradition. So the robust production of philosophy and logic in South Asia is a North Indian affair. Of course, it does spread throughout India, and there are contributions. It's mostly in Arabic. It goes back to Shiraz, which itself has a long engagement with the previous tradition, going all the way back to the logic textbook of the 13th century and to Avicenna. And then in South Asia, basically from the 17th through the early 20th centuries, where you see this heavy and sophisticated and exciting production of philosophical and logical works. So I hope that was
great. That was quite a whirlwind tour, but very clear. Thanks. So in there, you mentioned that there's this fundamental text that you're focusing on, which is the Sulam al-Ulum, the ladder of the sciences. So can you tell us about this text and its author, and maybe also something about its influence, since that's really the story you're telling in the book?
Great, yeah. So I do pick up the story, of course, with this text. It's called the Sulam al-Ulum, or the ladder of the sciences. It's written by a scholar called Muhibballah al-Bihari, who dies in the year 1707. So it's a late 17th century text. This is an author who also wrote a very important text in legal theory called the Musallam al-Thubut, which also was quite influential in South Asia. And again, like a number of these scholars, he had patronage from the nobility, and specifically and especially from the Mughal emperor. He traveled with him. He was appointed by him in very important administrative posts, because a lot of these scholars, of course, straddle many fields. So he was somebody who issued legal judgments, was responsible partly for collecting taxes, or not himself, of course, but was in charge of that affair, advised the Mughal emperor, traveled with his retinue all along South Asia, and especially, in fact, crossed into what was not then a border, but what is today a border, into Afghanistan, spent some time in Kabul, and so on. His work, the Sulam al-Ulum, a logic text that we'll speak about in more detail with reference to the commentarial work that happened on it, was very quickly picked up for assessment, engagement, and critique, even in his own lifetime. He himself wrote a commentary on it, and the commentarial practice then continued on it for about 200 years or so. So that's the figure we're looking at, and that's the book.
Can you actually quickly say something about just one detail there, which is that he writes a commentary on his own book? Because I think that might strike some viewers as a little bit odd. Like, why, if you had something to say, why not just say it in the book? Why do you need to write a commentary on your own book?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and I think it'll come up when we think more deeply about commentary as a genre and how it is responsible for the process of philosophizing. But very quickly, a number of these base texts, initial texts that are a culmination of long diachronic dialectics, are very pithy, and they are, and I'll elaborate on this later, they're meant to lead future commentators in certain directions. And the self-commentary is in some way, provides additional signposts for the kind of work that needs to be done on a base text by future generations. This happens also in other, genres of Islamic learning. In, for example, the usul tradition. I do give an example and some quotations from one usul work from an earlier period, legal theory work from an earlier period. So it's a general practice to produce a very simple, pithy, elusive base text, provide signposts, and then have those signposts sometimes lead to your own slightly more expanded explanations in your own words as a kind of a larger circuit of investigation and deep reading. So this is one of the reasons why self-commentaries were written. Okay, so now let's dig into the philosophy a bit here. So as you mentioned, we're talking about logic, and actually it strikes me that people may not quite be able to understand or immediately imagine what that means. So if you think about logic, maybe two things might spring to mind. One is like Aristotle's logic. And although Aristotle uses variables, Aristotle's logic is very unlike modern day logic, right? So if you go take a logic class now, it's sort of like taking a math course. So this is a change in logic that kind of goes back to Frege. So there's that problem of just like imagining what would I see if I opened a text like this? Am I seeing symbols? Am I seeing what am I seeing charts? What am I seeing? And I guess the other question is the range of topics they would cover in what they're calling logic. So is it really just, for example, about, validity conditions, or do they get into issues about philosophy of language? Does it even touch on metaphysics? So could you tell us sort of what the texts are like to read, insofar as that's possible, and also the range of things they get into while writing about logic? Yeah, so this requires, again, a very quick whirlwind set of explanations, right? So Aristotelian logic, as we know, as it was received in the Arabo-Islamic tradition, has various parts. There are, the formal books of the logic, and then there is what we call the material logic. The formal ones concern, for example, the categories, being the first book in that particular system, as inherited by the Arabs, is the categories, and which is this discussion of the ontology of entities, right? What categories of entities, or what kind of things there are. And then, of course, there's the De Interpretatione, which is effectively semantics and systems of signification for the purposes of doing reasoning and logic, put in a simplified term. And then, of course, there's a formal system of deduction and inference that we get in the prior analytics. And following that, there's the material logic, of course, the application of that formal system for deriving demonstrative knowledge in the posterior analytics, and epistemologically weaker kinds of conclusions would be drawn using the same system, but with different kinds of premises and modes of argumentation, sometimes in the rhetoric and so on. The poetics also was considered to be part of logic in the Arabo-Islamic tradition. Its function was to produce certain kinds of conclusions that would allow people to imagine certain things so that they may be induced to produce certain kinds of emotions in them, right? A desire to, for example, to approach something, and the desire to run away from something on the basis of how, for example, honey would be presented in a poetic syllogism as the equivalent of bile, yellow bile, for example, right? So logic had these different kinds of functions. In the Aristotelian tradition, as understood by the Arabs, these books were, maintained, and the focus generally in the time of Avicenna was on the deductive system, on the prior analytics, and quite a bit of work was done on modal logic there. Which means basically premises that have modalities attached to them. If it is necessary that A is B and it's possible that B is C, then what kind of conclusion and what kind of modality would be attached? That was an important element of the Avicennan system. And around it were, of course, other books which are considerably shorter. Avicenna, of course, writes also on rhetoric and poetics and so on. Following Avicenna, the discussion does focus on the prior analytics parts, and through the 13th century, when you get people like Khunaji and Katibi, whom I've mentioned. But as things move on, there's a shift in the kinds of contents that logical works are concerned with, and perhaps even a final embrace of the idea that the subject matter of logic is second intentions. In other words, those entities that would exist by virtue of being conceived in the mind, right? So subjecthood and predicatehood and so on are things, they are things indeed, they are in existence, they're concepts that one can engage, but those concepts exist by virtue of the fact of a proposition, existing in the mind, or a conception existing in the mind of something to which it points. So this idea that the subject matter of logic is second intentions, and then it's not really just a tool for deriving other kinds of knowledge, in my view, gets picked up as a serious concern of the logical tradition by the time you get to the Sulam. Of course, the standard position is that the logic is a tool of the sciences, but I'm not quite sure that the kind of work the Sulam is doing is true to that standard explanation of what logic does. What the Sulam is really concerned with, and late logic is concerned with, is provide something like a defense of recognizably true propositional claims and their established semantics, right? So there's an earlier tradition of dialectic and certain positions that are taken up by logic. And what these late logic texts like the Sulam do is to try to defend those propositional claims and the established semantics in the face of internal contradictions and paradoxes that appear when you look closely at certain kinds of claims and propositions. So these propositional features are brought under scrutiny, sometimes by virtue of their breach of some other established principle. So, for example, there's contraposition is a move that is allowed in logic. It's embraced also by the Sulam. But in certain cases, for example, where you would have an affirmative claim such as the impossible is absurd, which sounds like a true propositional claim, contraposition wouldn't work because the contradictory of the impossible, that which is impossible, is that which is possible, and the contradictory of absurdity is something that is possible and not absurd. And if you deny one of the other, as you do in a contraposition, then you'll come up with a false claim, or you'll end up positing a subject term that does not have any existential import. So anyway, I'm getting into the weeds of it. The point being that late logic like the Sulam begins to think about problems in established propositional claims and semantics. And then it tries to come up with different kinds of solutions to these internal problems of logic. So if you open the Sulam, much of the discussion is going to be about paradoxes, like the liar paradox, for example, and the paradox concerned with the rule of contraposition, for example. Paradox is concerned with conversion rules of modalities and so on. That's what logic becomes. And the focus on the prior analytics and inference and deduction rules begins to shift out increasingly so by the time you get to the Sulam. Again, I won't go into it, but that's probably
enough. So actually, what they're doing in some ways is not what we would mean by logic now. Like, so if you go take a logic class at a university in the United States, let's say, then you wouldn't immediately jump in to start thinking about semantic paradoxes, right? You'd be thinking about like truth tables and first order versus predicate logic and so on, right? So it's really quite a different kind of discourse than one might expect with just hearing the word logic.
Yeah, I think it's a second order reflection on the claims and established positions of logic that happen, that go on from Avicenna through Katibi, 13th century texts and so on. Those rules don't necessarily stand with reference to certain specific kinds of claims that seem to be true.
Yeah.
Right.
So it's really about trying to make the whole thing consistent, right?
Exactly. Yes.
So trying to get this. So it's almost like Gödel, right? It's like, are there holes? Does the whole thing hang together? Or do we, because if you discover, oh, well, actually this logical rule produces a paradox or even just like a very counterintuitive result, then that could seem to undermine the whole project. Right?
Exactly, yeah. And what they're after is, I keep running into this expression, they want a qanun kulli, a universal rule that would allow for all kinds of logical operations. But in certain propositions that are patently true, those rules don't seem to apply, right? So that's where paradoxes emerge. So you want to defend the rule, and how do you do so? Well, you can either undermine some other rule, but you don't want to do that. Or you find some way of considering a proposition such that it would have two features. Under one feature, the rule seems to break. Another feature, it doesn't. So you look for finer interpretive moves and so on. So it becomes second order reflection, on the logical rules that are established.
Yeah, I think something else that strikes me that they tend to do that you wouldn't see in what we might assume would turn up in a logic textbook is that they'll make distinctions about different ways of considering the same proposition, right? So they have this word etibar, which means like mode of consideration. And so they'll solve a problem by saying, well, if you consider the proposition in one way, then it's true. If you consider it another way, it's false. And that's why it's not both true and false, even though it looks like it's both true and false. Exactly. So there's a way you could dissolve problems like the liar paradox, for example. Yeah. So one thing that I think people might need convincing about here is that since we're talking about texts that come very late in the tradition, and as you've said, come on the heels of a lot of very innovative, impressive figures like Avicenna, Fakhreddin Arazi, Doani, I mean, all of these guys. So this has been going on for centuries. And then we get to a textbook, which gets further commentaries. I wonder whether there might be a kind of widespread assumption that this material is bound to be kind of repetitive or uninteresting or sort of retreading old ground or whatever, especially since if we're talking about commentaries, there might be an assumption that these are meant for students and you don't usually do super innovative work when you're talking to students, one might think, right? You kind of go over what everyone's supposed to know. And so I thought I might ask you to just give us an example from this later logical tradition where you think that they've clearly made an innovative or philosophically interesting move within the space that they're calling logic.
Great, yeah. So, I mean, you mentioned the liar paradox. Maybe that's someone that immediately comes to mind, maybe because you just mentioned it. I can maybe elaborate on that. Before I do, one thing I want to impress upon the audience is that the innovation might simply come sometimes in providing a new argument or something more economical undergirding the same conclusion, right? So originality would not, or dynamism would not necessarily depend on finding a new outcome, but thinking about the same truth in a different way or arguing for it in a better way, perhaps. Or sometimes an argument may emerge by the combination of different parts of other arguments into a new argument, right? So there would be recognizable parts, but you would deploy this claim or this general rule used here and combine it with this one to produce an argument that would give the same conclusion, right? So those are the kinds of things that often happen. And this is also why some of these texts look as if they're repeating the past, which they do. Sometimes they're long verbatim quotations, and we'll discuss all of that, I hope, when we get to the theory discussion, if we get a time for that. So to give you an example of the liar paradox, this is an argument that goes back in a serious and robust fashion already to Taftazani, who's a much earlier philosopher and logician and theologian, in his book Tahdhib al-Mantiq. So there are different kinds of issues and solutions and iterations of the liar paradox that are found in the tradition. So let me introduce this paradox for those of of the audience who may not know. It's a simple claim that this statement of mine is false, right? So it seems like a pretty straightforward and easy claim to make. It makes sense to us too. But when you parse it, you run into problems. You run into problems partly because it violates a general principle that any proposition that is informative in a certain way would be either true or false. That is a general rule. And this particular statement seems to be both, because if you say that this statement of mine is true, then it would fall, the statement of mine is false, then it would, if it is true, fall in the class of those statements that are indeed false. And if that's the case, then your claim is true. So by claiming that this statement of mine is false, if that statement is indeed false, I probably said it in reverse. If that statement is indeed false, it falls in the class of those statements that are false, and therefore it is indeed true that this statement of mine is false. And vice versa, of course. If the statement is indeed false, if it is true and not false, then it falls in the category of things that are false, and therefore the statement becomes false by virtue of being true. So there's an oscillation back and forth, and something like an internal oscillation between the truth values, truth and falsity for this proposition. So how do you solve this problem? So there are a number of solutions that are presented in the sources, and the Sulam falls back on this basic technique, right? So there are certain techniques that become the favorites of different texts and their commentators to solve these kinds of paradoxes. And the technique it uses is to fall back on the difference between what we call a mujmal reading or a mufassal reading of a proposition. A mujmal reading is what I translate as a compressed reading of a claim, and a mufassal is an expressed reading. So for example, if I say this statement of mine is false, the mujmal reading would simply capture it as P, right? So you're not expanding the statement itself. The expanded or expressed reading of the same statement, this statement of mine is false, would be this statement of mine is false, right? Because you open up this statement, which is this statement is false, right? So one more time, this statement of mine is false can be captured as P. That's a mujmal reading, the compressed reading, or you can expand it when you say this statement of mine is false. Well, this statement of mine is indeed this statement of mine is false. So it will become this statement of mine is false. Now, the mujmal reading allows you to make claims about a proposition. So when you say P is false, the criterion for it being false is the attribute of being false of P. And that is indeed true. And then you're done with the oscillation. So in the mujmal reading, the claim is simply about the nature or the attribute or the quality of the proposition, which is P, and that proposition P has the quality of being attributed as the subject being attributed as false.
And so you could say this statement of mine is false is in English. You're attributing the property of being in English to that statement. So you're just attributing the property of being false to that statement. It's fine. That's
it. And that's indeed what the claim is. And P is indeed false in that case. And that's what the attribute was. And now you don't have the oscillation. So the solution is, well, you're reading it the wrong way, or that paradox is being produced by the i'tabar or consideration that you mentioned, or reading it in an expressed fashion. If you read it in an expressed fashion, then you get the oscillation. If you read it in the compressed fashion, then the oscillation ceases. So this is one of the solutions hinted at, by the way, before the Sulam in other texts that the Sulam embraces, but of course the commentators are not always happy. And they introduce various kinds of problems even with this kind of reading, but we don't have to elaborate on that. So this is one example of, the kind of innovative solutions being produced in this tradition.
Yeah, I think you can really tell there that they've gotten into logical issues as a topic worthy of consideration in their own right. Because like this classical idea that you even find before we get to the Arabic tradition in antiquity, that logic is not a part of philosophy, but it's just an instrument of philosophy. It puts a lot of emphasis on the idea that you're just generating machinery that you can then use to do like physics or something, right? But sorting out the liar paradox obviously isn't like that, right? I mean, you don't need to figure out what the solution to the liar paradox is in order to do physics. It's just something they got interested in for its own sake.
Right, yeah, exactly. I mean, so this is, as I was saying, a second order reflection on what may be considered to be basic rules of logic. And they're seeing that in certain cases, the rules are not holding up. And that, of course, produces anxiety. But then the purpose of logic becomes very different. It's no longer an organon, right? It's not an ala or a tool anymore. Well, they're going to keep claiming that it is. One of the ways they stop in this hair-splitting ongoing focus on these interesting paradoxes, which is the substance of innovation, by the way, is that sometimes at the end of 10 pages of back and forth disquisition, an author would come along and say, well, this is all great, but this is not what logic is supposed to do. They do remember it.
Oh, wait a minute, this is an instrument.
Yeah, so after doing all the work, they say, wait, hold on. It's only an instrument, and this is let's stop, right? So
yeah, right.
But that's just a rhetorical ploy. I don't think it's.
Having said everything that I wanted to say, no, yeah. So speaking of which, let's talk a little bit about this. This is a really interesting dimension of your book, and I think kind of an unexpected dimension because you're quite well known as a historian of logic, and I think people would have thought, okay, it's about commentaries in a logical textbook. It's all going to be about these kinds of issues. And although you certainly address that in detail, you also talk a lot about the very genre at stake here, namely the commentary genre. And that I think makes the book interesting, even for people who aren't as fascinated by Arabic logic as we are, because commentaries turn up in many, many traditions, right? So in Indian philosophy and in Latin, Christian medieval philosophy and so on, full of commentaries, right? And even beyond philosophy, right? So there's this real meditation on the nature of commentary as such in your book. And I thought a way into this might be to say something about the title of your book, which is Palimpsests of Themselves. And so this might require some explanation, even at the level of telling people what a palimpsest is. But can you explain why you use this sort of metaphor for talking about commentaries?
Great, yeah, thank you. In an article, because the book was, I think I was mentioning to you, and in fact, you being a close colleague probably have memories of this. The book was finished a while ago. And it was announced some while ago too in an article in a footnote, that article that came out, I think in 2013 or something, and the footnote had that title. The title comes from a conversation I had with a friend of mine. I think we were in Kansas City, and he's an artist. And I was talking to him about how in that early stage, I was seeing the work of commentaries as being, as generating themselves into future commentarial practices, and those future commentarial practices generating their own selves in yet another future commentarial practice, and so on. So he said, well, have you seen this self-portrait by Albrecht Dürer, where he's in front of a mirror, and the mirror, of course, is reflecting his image, and the painting is reflecting him painting himself in the mirror. And there's a back and forth sort of deep continuity of mirror images in that particular portrait. And so as we were discussing this, he's the one who actually expressed it. He said, well, it's like a palimpsest of itself. A palimpsest, for those of you of the audience who may not know, is actually a piece of paper on which there is some writing, which or parchment actually, normally, parchment or a papyrus, which has been whitewashed after it has served its function, and which then serves as a new medium on which new writing would happen. And then it would be whitewashed again, and after it has served its purpose, and then another writing would happen. Normally speaking, the layers of the palimpsest do not reflect earlier layers. They would have often no relation to each other. You might get late antique Greek text written on some papyrus, which is then whitewashed, and you get Arabic completely unrelated to that. So it is a palimpsest in the sense that there are layerings that are going on in commentaries, but the palimpsests of them very selves, because each lower layer is the agent some way in a very deliberate fashion of producing itself, its own voice, and extending its voice into the next layer. That next layer has its own agency, its own program and philosophical agenda, certainly, but it's working through the voice and being compelled and moved forward by the voice of the lower layer to produce a certain kind of writing that is an extension of the voice of the earlier layer, but also producing something of its own within that ambit, within that scope. And then doing the same thing for the next layer, right? So it's become something like a self-generating layering, and each part is an agent of its own, but is also being compelled by the lower part to produce something new. So that's the metaphor that I used, in thinking about how commentarial practice works. And again, I'd be happy to elaborate more if you wish as to how this machinery of the commentary works. But that's the title and
Yeah.
the theme of the
So
book.
maybe one thing we need to make clear is that there's also the phenomenon of the super commentary, which is a commentary on a commentary, right? So that's why, because people might be thinking, well, there's only two layers. There's the source text and there's a commentary, right? But actually it's more complicated than that. In addition to which they may be referring to other commentaries or other earlier texts. They may be like plucking something from Dawani or whatever and bringing it into a commentary on the Sulam. So that you've got things from the past kind of being revived and used to comment on this more recent text and so on. So it's actually very complicated, right?
Yeah. I mean, to use Robert Wisnowski's expression, there are commentaries and then there's super commentaries, and then he says super duper commentaries, and there's sometimes even super duper duper commentaries, and so yeah, it's this continuation of a tradition in an intricate, connected way.
What do you think this tells us about the people who were expected to read these commentaries? I mean, does it demand particular habits of mind or habits of reading to deal with a text like that?
Yeah, I think these kinds of commentaries, I say in the book, are really not meant to be read. They're meant to be written, right? And I know it sounds, rhetorically fun, and it may be confusing, though what I mean by that, of course, they're read, right? You can't write a commentary on some lower text without reading it. But there's a certain orality within the lower, base text, let's say, right? It is a text, of course, that's written, but it has certain motivating factors for producing the writing on the next layer. So if you're reading a commentary, your main function in this particular network of scholarship, in this particular domain, is really reading it for the purpose of writing upon it. It's not a passive project of absorption. It's really supposed to be an active project of producing a new palimpsest of the earlier palimpsest.
And another thing that's worth thinking about, and this, I guess the clearest case would be actually Bihari himself writing a commentary on his own text. What that shows you is that the original text, the Sulam, is written, to put it mildly, with an eye to the prospect of future commentaries, almost to the point where if no one ever commented on the text, then it would not have fulfilled its purpose, right?
Yeah, in fact,
it might seem a very strange thought, actually.
Yeah, there's a quote that from one of the commentators of the Sulam. His name is Mullah Mubin, and he said, I'll read this only about 5 lines, and he tells you in a way how to think about a base text and its commentarial practices, right? So he says, a base text, or it's called a matan, a base text is what is hard and difficult and in need of a commentary, a sharh, or an opening, right? Because it's supposed to be this sort of elusive, compacted thing. And that's what his definition is. Then he says, and he's actually responding or commenting on the supplication of Bihari, which is the base text. And Bihari says, make my book among base texts like the sun among the stars. So he's trying to explain that. So then he says, so the statement of Bihari is a supplicatory statement. And he says, its meaning is, God, make this matan or base text among the ordered mutun or base texts with respect to its fame, like the sun among the stars. For when the sun rises, the stars, in this case, the other mutun, the other base text, when the sun rises, the stars become dim and are not seen even when they exist. So God granted his prayer, and the scholars, how did he grant his prayer? How did he make it famous? Well, God granted his prayer, and the scholars wrote commentaries on it, so that it came to be widely circulated among the students of the madaris, of the religious colleges, and other base texts or other mutun came to be obscured. Right. So the point here is that the fame or the value of a base text lies precisely in the fact of a commentary being written on it. That's how the prayer is granted. If nobody wrote on it, people,
like
everybody can read. He's not saying that people read this text all the time. That would not be the granting of the prayer. The granting of the prayer is people writing commentaries on it. That's what makes this a famous text.
Yeah.
So,
These days it's how many copies can you sell, but back
Yeah.
then it was how many commentaries can you generate. By the way, I should mention that in about 5 minutes, we're going to open the discussion for Q&A. So if people want to send in their questions or start thinking about their questions, while of course paying attention to the next 5 minutes at the same time, that would be good. So just staying on this topic for a moment, I wonder how we should think about the commentaries and what's found in them relative to the matan, the base text, because it almost, since the base text is written in this extremely compressed way, which more than calls out for commentary, but even requires commentary to sort of exploit the full potential of the text, we might say. I wonder whether there's a sense in which all of the possible commentaries are supposed to be somehow encapsulated in the base text, so that what the commentators are doing is just kind of unfolding it, or actually sort of like you were saying before, there's the compressed version of the proposition and there's the expressed version, so that it would be like sort of taking something that, like a compressed file, like a zip file. I think we've talked about this before, this metaphor. So taking a zip file and expanding it, and that's what a commentary does, as opposed to another idea though, which might be that you're kind of fighting against the source text, right? Because of course they don't necessarily agree with Bihari about all of these issues. So what's going on there, do you think, or what's the dominant feeling?
Yeah, the reason I feel that there is both support and critique of a base text in the commentarial space is that the base text itself is as you just mentioned, is a compression of long-standing earlier dialectics of the tradition. So you can think of the Sulam as encapsulating and taking positions in organic fashion with a philosophical and logical program of a series of problems that were being debated in the tradition the century before. I say in my book that I don't look back at that century unless the commentarial space forces me to go back to it, right? Because you can actually explore that space on its own terms and understand what the Sulam is doing through it. And of course, you can just let the Sulam's commentary take you as far as in the past as it wish. So again, imagine that there's a whole range of debates and dialectics that are going on various topics, and a logic text, a pithy short one of about 25, 30 pages is written. And it takes various positions on these dialectical, on these dialectics, on these topics. And that's the first thing it does. And it sets these dialectics in the form of a traditional textbook that is recognizable. So you can see that it will first, deal with perhaps a little bit with the categories, and then go into the interpretazione and so on, and move forward. Now, what's happening, what is neat, a lot of us do know that commentaries, the base texts often are short. This is known in other traditions too. What my interest was to see what is the machinery and mechanism through which the base text and the commentaries are interacting. And I think this is where something neat emerges. What you see is that this compressed space of the base text that is encapsulating the earlier dialectic within itself holds certain keys to opening and support and to critique. So, for example, a base text may make a certain claim, and often you would find an expression such as fatadabbar, reflect on it, or fata'ammal, again, contemplate this. And because the written text has an oral motion, it is a living text, the commentator would take that particular expression for think about it, reflect on it, as an ishara, or as an indication that he should take that particular phrase preceding the command to reflect, and find solutions either to critique it or to expand it. Often, a base text writer would take a position and give an argument that it knows is a bad argument or a weak argument, thus an ending with a command compelling the commentator to find strength for that argument. And often what would happen is that particular command, reflect, would be understood by the commentator that he should go to another part of that same base text, a work that the base text author could have done, and connect those two parts to support the claim, to provide some kind of an internal consistency. Or in certain cases, we would take that particular command to go to the self-commentary of the author, where the author, again, directly or indirectly would provide certain other clues so that the commentator may do his job, right? So this is how, also in the sense that it is a palimpsest. The commentator is often read, and these are in the prolegomena, these are expressions that you find, they often read the base text as a kind of a treasure trove, or an oracular kind of text, which gives you sufficient hints to realize its own self in the commentarial voice. In many ways, the commentarial voice is, you can imagine it in this theoretical space as the continuation of the voice of the base text, because it's leading you to different places and fulfilling itself. Now, in the motion that happens, going sometimes being led by the base text to the past, or being led by the base text to the self-commentary, and from that self-commentary to another part of the base text, the work that the commentator ends up doing sometimes is to critique. They realize that the different arguments that are being presented and where the base text is being led is not sufficiently good. They was present a larger argument and then critique it. And of course, commentators, are philosophers in their own right. So sometimes they would be led in this direction, and because of their own philosophical program would present a critique. So this is the sense in which I mean that these are palimpsests of themselves. And then, by the way, the commentator would do the same thing, provide certain answers, give you some, the light of a lamp. You see some things, but then certain things are deliberately obscure. They'll drop hints along the way so that the next commentator can fulfill and complete that voice. The last thing I'll say on this, because I've spoken a lot, is that those commentaries that were completely clear, right? They're not functioning in this way, become generally sterile in the tradition. You would expect a good, solid, extended commentary that explains everything to you to be the most valuable one in the tradition. But the author that I mentioned, Mubin, by the way, for example, which literally means something that is clear or clarifying in the tradition, is a text that students were told not to really engage because it was too mubin, right? It was too clear. You don't want to engage in a practice of commenting with a text that gives you everything.
You want just no chance to do anything yourself anymore.
Yeah.
It's like handing someone a paint by numbers thing where it's all filled in.
Yeah. It's that perpetuating voice and a diachronically synchronous voice that you get through the machinery of the commentary. So
we have a couple of questions so far that come in on YouTube, actually both from James Porter. So first question is, as with the case of logic, how do the commentarial examples you discuss in your book differ from ancient classical and modern commentaries?
Yeah, I think so. Thanks, Jim, for that question. I think it's the machinery that I was just now describing, which is the function of this machinery of dropping hints and leading the commentator as a guide by the hand to different parts of the tradition to complete and fulfill the voice of the lower base text. And then the commentator engaging in the same fashion with the same kind of machinery going forward. I think that particular kind of diachronically synchronous production of a voice and its actualization is perhaps somewhat different. It's understanding that every text upon which a commentary would be written, and therefore a commentary upon which a super commentary would be written, each one of them is an oracular voice that will sort of lead, give you some shadows and some clues, and is an expectation of future projection of your voice into the articulation and the exploitation sometimes of the future commentator. It's a certain orality, living orality within the written textual space that is perpetuated. I'm not sure if this mechanism, so wonderfully deployed in the commentarial space of texts like the Sulam, is I don't know if that instrument is so well deployed in ancient commentaries, for example. But you might know more about that, Jim, of course.
And also he asks, in both cases, what can we gain from reading about these practices beyond the historical insight, perhaps by expanding our understanding of our own practices today? It's a very interesting question.
Yeah, well, this is actually why I got into commentaries, because let me backtrack a little bit. The reason I started doing this work on this book is this now defunct, but still confusing and long-standing position that there was a decline in the production of rationalist disciplines in Islam after, let's say, the 12th century or something. And Orientalists, until not too long ago, people like Watt and even, another eminent scholar like Farnes, for example, have pointed to commentaries as indicative of that decline. So I began to wonder, well, what is the way in which I can think of commentarial practice? Is there a specific logic to them through which we can even ask the question about dynamism and decline? In other words, what is the standard of authorship? And what is the position of originality that would allow us to then, having posited, those standards, can answer the question of dynamism and decline, right? So here, for example, originality becomes very clear, is an invention of the Romantic period, right? This is the author in court who argues that, well, my work is my voice. And, you get these copyright laws and so on in Europe, where the author becomes this original genius. In the case of the commentarial space, there's a lot of verbatim unattributed quotation. And the commentator often supports the position of the base text. But what's happening here is that something like a diachronous agency for each layer that is produced, while at the same time an earlier author is leading the new author in certain directions, right? This is why there's repetition. There's a logical repetition in these commentaries. This is why claims to originality, though they do exist, of course, are not rampant in the sources. It's a different kind of authorship, different kind of originality. And within that context, then the larger, lesson to draw is, well, when we ask questions about the dynamism or decline of a tradition, what are the theoretical frameworks that we are going to first posit internal to the tradition, by virtue of which we can answer that question?
Mm-hmm. Actually, here's a question sort of inspired by that question. There's a couple more coming in, but just very quickly then. Did you think about yourself as a commentator, sort of relative to this? Like, so you're commenting on all these commentaries, right? So aren't you just the next one in the chain? Or did you see yourself as somehow outside of that?
Right. I did not deliberately think of myself as a commentator, but what ended up happening has to do with my personal history, actually, which was not entirely, not in the least bit deliberate. So let me backtrack for a second. Dealing with these written texts for these authors was not working with a sterile text you're supposed to receive. You're in engagement with an author who is alive in many ways. And I don't mean that as a romantic notion. This is something that people seem to have lived through. So going back to my personal example, my grandfather was in the Khairabadi tradition, which, as I mentioned, is a tradition that comes out of the Farangi Mali tradition. And as a boy, I was fascinated by the work he would do. He has commentarial notes on a number of the commentaries on the Sulam. So being fascinated by this, I actually used to steal some of his books. And after he passed away in my trips to Pakistan, I stole more of them. And when I would be struggling with some issues, especially in this text called Hamdullah, who's a Shi'i commentator on the Sulam, I would often go to my grandfather's marginal notes on these philosophical and logical paradoxes. In a number of cases, you would find him saying the following. He would say that last night I could not figure out the solution to such and such a problem. And I prayed 2 cycles of prayer for the author. And having done so, when I went to sleep, I had a debate with him. And when I woke up, having conversed with him, the solution had become apparent to me. The author himself had led me to the solution, right? In the same sense as I've been saying that the base text is going to lead you, the commentator, to find the points, to fill its voice out and to actualize it as sort of as inhabiting you in a certain way, right? Through your dreams in this case. He inhabits you and you speak the author. So this was an interesting, observation or realization on my part when I was sort of done with the book and I was writing the acknowledgements. I realized that I, in some ways, through my grandfather and through his dreams, worked through this tradition, with Alhamdulillah and so on. So I guess to that extent, I was part of a living tradition for a little while. Yeah, I did not engage it, of course, as a traditional scholar because I was not thinking in those modes.
Yeah. So we have at least another couple of questions and 5 minutes left. So it looks like we'll have plenty to keep us busy. So Hassan Besakani, hi Hassan, says, to what extent might writing an obscure commentary be a way of job security for the author and teacher, or maybe a way of showing that you're doing something as a scholar, or maybe it could be a way of preventing autodidacts. And he actually put a quote from Fakhreddin: "There's no doubt that a human can learn on his own." And so this idea of like trying to keep these self-learners out. What do you think of that?
I would say that would be a terrible move, Hassan. And nice to hear from you. I'm glad you're here. No, I think commentaries that become famous, as we saw in the quotation from Mubin, require writing, right? And there is an oral aspect of it, guidance and training that the master had control of. It's a written text that is constantly in motion, and you do need guidance, both with the hints embedded in the written piece, but at the same time, somebody who's written a commentary, having been led by his own guide, then becoming the guide. There's an oral textuality and textual orality. One of the things I explore in the book in one of the chapters is how a 1916 debate on a different topic, but on the rationalist disciplines, was constantly spilling back and forth between the oral space and this textualization, and the textualization would motivate debates between two sides, in front of a Nawab, for example, reported on in a textual space and spilled back into other super commentaries in that textual space, and then spilled back out. So if you want job security, you want to remain relevant. And that's one way to secure it, sure, to write that kind of commentary or base text.
Yeah. Right. And maybe this will be our last question, but we might have time for one more. This is from Shiraz Ali. So, do you agree that self-commentary functions like cheat sheets for the learner engaging a base text, whereas for the commentator, it provides a basis for verifying or citing their own reading of the matn?
I think I would say simply yes. Yeah, that's one of the things it does.
So it's so in other words, just to spell that out, is the idea that like this is Bihari kind of like reminding himself what he thinks. So it's almost like lecture notes or something.
Yeah, I think that's one of the functions, of course. Yeah.
So actually, something you touched on, but I thought I might ask you sort of as we wrap up here is, something that's quite striking about this is the long running continuity of this tradition. And you just mentioned that your own grandfather was somehow still within that tradition, right? So we're almost in touching distance of like now. And that makes me wonder, like, is that true? So is this something that's, as it were, still going on?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And here, a certain unexpected outcome or certain things I'll say that might be counterintuitive or unexpected. I think the fact that this tradition was dynamic in the way we have discussed, right? Having posited a different theory of authorship and different way of thinking about commentaries, having done that, the reason the tradition was dynamic under those terms is because it had not succumbed to certain practices and trappings of modernity, such as, for example, print culture. Mass dissemination of these texts, whether they're commentaries or base texts, has destroyed reception of commentary as something you write. It has become something you read, right? So it has become a stagnant thing. My grandfather was certainly writing his commentaries and marginal notes on lithographs, but even those lithographs, the ones, of course, clearly where he was able to write, have margins, sufficient margins that are left available for him to write. A base text that would be written on these in manuscript form, we know would deliberately actually have the pages this big. It would only have this much of the writing on it, and you just leave the rest blank as a way to write commentaries, not just read the base text or read the commentary. So one thing that undoes the system is print culture and adoption of print culture in these institutions. Another thing that undoes it is that the institutions themselves, the Western-styled university systems that teach Islamic studies, or even some of these texts, which is very, very rare, those kinds of systems do not allow for this oralized textual dialectic to happen, right? So those kinds of systems, my grandfather was not a part of. He was a madrasa person. Trained students in that tradition, wrote these commentaries and engaged, I think, in this long authorship, authorship extended over decades and centuries. So I think that's one thing I would say. It was a living tradition until the trappings of modernity undid it. And you'd expect those kinds of tools and instruments like print culture and modern universities and so on, in fact, to enhance these traditions. But in fact, this was the death of it.
Yeah.
The loss of the manuscript tradition, for example, was the end of dynamism within this particular mold. Yeah.
Okay, well, on that sobering note, it's exactly, well, here it's 10 p.m. I think it's there 1 p.m. So time for you to stop, definitely time for me to stop because it's time for bed. So thank you so much for telling us about your book and the fascinating contents that it covers. It's an amazing book. And like I say, I mean, it's obviously something that anyone who's interested in the history of Arabic logic and Arabic philosophy or philosophy in the Islamic world should consult. But I think even anyone who's interested in the role of commentary in intellectual disciplines of any kind, which obviously is, almost every free modern culture that I'm aware of, could really benefit from consulting, especially the part of the book where you talk about the sort of palimpsest effect. So congratulations on the book, and thanks for joining me to talk about it, Asad.
Pleasure, Peter. It was great to see you. Yeah, see you again soon.
Okay.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Bye.